The first rulers of Earth's skies did not have feathers. They had wings of chitin, compound eyes built for hunting, and bodies unlike anything alive today. 300 million years ago, something with a wingspan of 70 centimeters, that is about 28 inches, crossed the air above endless coal forests. It hunted on the wing with spined legs that snapped shut around prey before it had a chance to escape. It was called Meganeura moni. It was not a bird. It lived 100 million years before the first dinosaurs ever appeared. Nor was it alone. Another griffinfly grew even larger. On the forest floor below, Arthropleura moved between towering plants, reaching 2.7 meters in length, that is about 9 feet, making it the largest land invertebrate our planet has ever known. This was not an isolated chapter in Earth's history. For 150 million years, giant insects ruled the air while giant arthropods dominated the ground. The atmosphere held more oxygen than it does today, and for generations of scientists, that seemed to explain everything. Then the pattern broke. The oxygen story, though partly true, could no longer explain what the fossils were saying. More than 10,000 fossil insect wings, collected from hundreds of sites around the world, revealed a moment when the rules changed. Insect size continued to fall, even when the atmosphere should have allowed those giants to remain. Something else had entered the story, something the largest insects had never faced before. If you'd like to see more stories like this, I'd really appreciate you taking a second to like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, are you listening with your feet up after a long day, or are you just getting your day underway? Now, let's return to the forests of the Carboniferous. Earth entered the Carboniferous period approximately 359 million years ago and remained within it until about 299 million years ago. Across those 60 million years, the planet settled into conditions unlike any before or since. The atmosphere itself became unusually rich in oxygen, reaching between roughly 30 and 35%, compared with about 21% today. That sustained concentration stands as the highest known level in Earth's history, creating possibilities that later ages would never again experience. For insects, this difference reached into every movement of their bodies. They do not breathe with lungs or carry oxygen through blood as mammals do. Their bodies contain an intricate network of branching tubes called tracheae. These passages deliver oxygen directly to tissues, spreading through the body until even the smallest structures receive what they need. At ordinary atmospheric conditions, this arrangement works with remarkable efficiency for small animals. As body size increases, however, the journey becomes more difficult. Oxygen can no longer diffuse deeply enough to satisfy every cell, placing a natural limit on growth. The Carboniferous atmosphere lifted that limit. Richer oxygen reached farther through those branching tubes, allowing tissues buried deeper inside the body to remain supplied. A larger frame no longer carried the same respiratory penalty. Evolution responded over countless generations, expanding forms that earlier environments would have restrained. Gigantism emerged through ordinary natural selection, encouraged by physical conditions that favored larger bodies without demanding entirely new biological designs. The landscape supported those opportunities at every turn. Immense lycopsid trees, distant relatives of today's club mosses, stretched upward to nearly 30 meters, which is about 98 feet. Their trunks rose above sprawling wetlands, where water lingered across broad lowlands near the equator. Ferns, horsetails, and seed ferns crowded every available space, producing enormous quantities of plant material that accumulated layer upon layer. Across immense spans of time, much of that vegetation would become the coal deposits that still lie beneath parts of the modern world. Above those forests, another circumstance shaped evolution just as strongly as oxygen. No birds crossed the canopy, no bats hunted after sunset, no flying reptiles patrolled the air. Vertebrate predators had not yet claimed the sky, leaving insects alone within an aerial environment that belonged entirely to them. Flight offered freedom without sustained pursuit from faster, warm blooded hunters, allowing size itself to become an advantage instead of a burden. Many different arthropod lineages answered those conditions in their own ways. Griffinflies, such as Meganeura and the even larger Meganeuropsis, expanded wingspans to nearly 70 centimeters, which is about 28 inches. Arthropleura reached approximately 2.7 meters in length, which is about 8.9 feet, gliding across the forest floor beneath heavy armor. Pulmonoscorpius grew beyond 70 centimeters, which is about 28 inches, becoming one of the dominant predators on land. Giant mayflies drifted through humid air, oversized cockroaches explored the undergrowth, and silverfish far exceeded the scale of their modern relatives. Taken together, these animals reveal something deeper than isolated curiosities. Multiple branches of the arthropod family tree independently moved toward enormous size while sharing the same atmosphere and the same ecological opportunities. The Carboniferous did not produce a single giant. It produced an entire living world where becoming larger made evolutionary sense, and where life explored possibilities that later ages would gradually close. Among the many creatures carried upward by the Carboniferous atmosphere, one lineage mastered flight with extraordinary refinement. The griffinflies belonged to an extinct order related to dragonflies, although they stood apart as their own branch of evolution. Their wings traced broad arcs through open air for millions of years, shaping a chapter in natural history that began with discovery in stone, long before scientists understood how exceptional these animals truly were. The first fossil of Meganeura emerged in the year 1880 from the Stephanian coal measures at Commentry, France. 5 years later, the French paleontologist Charles Brongniart formally described and named the species. The name Meganeura means large veins, referring to the intricate network that strengthened each wing. Every valid specimen known today is preserved within the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, where delicate impressions in ancient rock still preserve the pattern of veins that once carried one of Earth's greatest aerial hunters across prehistoric skies. Another member of the family would eventually eclipse even this famous predator. Meganeuropsis permiana, discovered in what is now Kansas and Oklahoma in the United States, reached the greatest size ever confirmed for a flying insect. Additional fossils uncovered in China and Russia reveal that these remarkable hunters ranged across the immense supercontinent of Pangaea, occupying habitats separated today by thousands of kilometers. Their distribution reflects a world whose continents had not yet drifted apart, allowing related populations to spread across enormous connected landscapes. Engineering studies of the largest known specimens estimate a body mass between 100 and 150 grams. That weight remained light enough for sustained flight while providing the strength needed to overpower struggling prey. Their success depended on more than wings alone. Each pair of legs carried rows of sturdy spines along the tibia and tarsi, forming what researchers often describe as a flying trap. During pursuit, those limbs could snap together around insects already in motion, securing prey before escape became possible. Modern dragonflies still use the same basic hunting technique, preserving an ancient design that has endured across immense spans of evolutionary history. Vision almost certainly played an equally important role. Their compound eyes were likely enlarged in proportion to the body, providing broad fields of view suited for tracking movement from multiple directions at once. Studies of close relatives, including Meganeura and Meganeurites, suggest these predators favored open habitats where long, uninterrupted flight could unfold. Such environments rewarded speed, endurance, and careful aerial control more than weaving through dense vegetation. Most prey probably consisted of other insects, which were themselves abundant and often unusually large. A wingspan approaching 70 centimeters, which is about 28 inches, also placed smaller amphibians within the realm of possibility. Although direct fossil evidence of such attacks has not been discovered, the physical capability existed for encounters that would seem astonishing beside any modern pond. Across more than 50 million years, no other creature matched their combination of size, speed, and aerial skill. They occupied the highest level of the airborne food web with little meaningful competition, refining a style of flight that represented the peak of insect predation during one of the most distinctive chapters in Earth's biological history. While griffinflies commanded the open air, another giant followed a very different path across the forest floor. Its broad body left tracks through damp vegetation, carrying layer upon layer of protective armor across ground that few other animals could challenge. This was Arthropleura, an arthropod whose story has continued to change even after more than a century and a half of scientific study. The first remains of Arthropleura were described in the year 1854. Even with that early discovery, one crucial piece remained missing. Paleontologists had uncovered body segments, trackways, and fragments of its enormous exoskeleton, yet the head itself refused to appear. For generations, every reconstruction relied on educated assumptions. Then, in the year 2024, research published in Science Advances finally revealed a fossilized head. That single discovery transformed long accepted ideas about the creature's identity. For decades, Arthropleura had been placed firmly among the millipedes because its body closely resembled their familiar form. The newly described head presented a different picture. Several anatomical features showed unexpected similarities with centipedes, indicating that Arthropleura belonged to an older branch positioned between those two modern groups. That branch has no living representatives today. Its closest relatives disappeared long ago, leaving this remarkable animal as one of the last known examples of an evolutionary experiment that reached extraordinary proportions. Fully grown individuals stretched to approximately 2.7 meters in length, which is about 8.9 feet, while weighing close to 50 kilograms. In overall bulk, that placed them alongside a large dog, although their flattened bodies approached the length of a small automobile. Every movement carried an exoskeleton built from roughly 30 jointed body segments. Each segment supported three overlapping plates, producing a flexible shield that protected nearly the entire animal while still allowing steady movement across uneven ground. Evidence for those dimensions remains surprisingly scarce. Only three confirmed body fossils of Arthropleura have ever been discovered. One of the most significant emerged during the year 2018 on a beach in Northumberland. A single fossilized body segment measured approximately 75 centimeters, which is about 30 inches. That fragment represented only one portion of the complete animal, making it the oldest and largest specimen known so far. Every confirmed discovery comes from regions that once lay close to Earth's equator, reflecting a strong preference for warm, humid forests. These habitats supplied abundant vegetation and deep layers of decaying plant matter. Although the appearance of Arthropleura suggests a formidable predator, the structure of its limbs tells another story. They lack the grasping or piercing adaptations expected in an active hunter. Most researchers therefore conclude that it fed primarily on fallen vegetation and decomposing organic material, recycling nutrients through ecosystems already rich with plant life. Fossilized trackways reveal a deliberate pace, with broad rows of footprints advancing across ancient sediments. Speed offered little advantage to such a heavily protected animal. Few predators possessed either the size or the equipment needed to penetrate its armored covering, allowing endurance to matter more than haste. Above these forests, griffinflies continued their aerial patrols while Arthropleura carried on below, each dominating a different layer of the same ecosystem. Together they formed one of the most distinctive communities ever assembled on land, where enormous arthropods occupied both earth and sky with an authority unmatched before or since. Some discoveries arrive as a spectacular fossil lifted from stone. Others emerge only after thousands of scattered observations are gathered into a single picture. The turning point in the story of giant insects belonged to the second kind. It appeared through patient measurement, careful comparison, and the realization that hundreds of millions of years could be read as one continuous record. In the year 2012, paleontologist Matthew Clapham of the University of California, Santa Cruz, together with researcher Jared Carr, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. Their work brought together one of the largest collections of fossil insect measurements ever assembled. Rather than relying on a handful of celebrated specimens, they compiled approximately 10,500 fossil wing lengths drawn from published scientific literature covering nearly the entire history of winged insects. Wings provided the ideal record. Complete insect bodies are uncommon in the fossil record because delicate tissues rarely survive burial and compression. Wings, by contrast, preserve with remarkable consistency. Their vein patterns remain sharply impressed in ancient rock, allowing scientists to estimate body size even when the rest of the animal has disappeared. By arranging thousands of these measurements across geological time, Clapham and Carr produced a timeline extending from the earliest winged insects in the Devonian through much of subsequent evolutionary history. Once those measurements were compared with independent estimates of atmospheric oxygen, an elegant relationship emerged. For approximately 150 million years, the largest insects followed oxygen with striking consistency. Whenever oxygen concentrations climbed, the maximum body size recorded in fossils also increased. As oxygen declined, the upper limit of insect size fell alongside it. The pattern repeated through age after age, with very little deviation, linking atmospheric chemistry and biological scale through an unexpectedly consistent rhythm. During the Carboniferous and the following Permian period, oxygen reached its greatest sustained abundance, rising to roughly 31 through 35%. Those same intervals also produced the largest flying insects and the largest terrestrial arthropods ever known. Later, as oxygen gradually decreased through the Triassic period, fossil evidence showed maximum insect size declining as well. The relationship remained so dependable that many researchers regarded oxygen as the dominant force governing insect gigantism, perhaps even the only one required to explain the pattern. That conclusion rested on more than coincidence. It reflected a statistical agreement repeated across immense stretches of geological history. Every new fossil seemed to reinforce the same connection, giving the impression of a biological rule rooted in the physical limits of insect respiration. The atmosphere appeared to dictate the boundaries within which evolution could operate, while insects merely explored the possibilities available inside those limits. Viewed as a single curve across 150 million years, the evidence carried the reassuring simplicity that scientists rarely encounter in nature. One variable rose, another followed. One declined, the other answered in kind. Few relationships in paleontology appeared so orderly or so persuasive. Then the curve changed. The measurements themselves remained reliable, and the atmospheric reconstructions continued to improve. Yet beyond a certain point, the agreement between oxygen and insect size no longer held. The fossils began tracing a path that chemistry alone could not predict, revealing that another influence had entered the history of the skies and permanently altered the course of insect evolution. Change first appeared in the forests long before it reached the creatures that depended upon them. Around 305 million years ago, the living fabric of the Carboniferous world began to unravel through a climatic transformation now known as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. It unfolded gradually across geological time, altering landscapes that had remained connected for millions of years and reshaping the conditions that had allowed giant arthropods to flourish. The great tropical forests that once spread across equatorial Pangaea no longer formed one continuous ecosystem. Shifts toward cooler and drier climates interrupted the steady warmth and abundant moisture that those forests required. Wetlands shrank, dense vegetation retreated. Broad expanses of forest became separated into isolated pockets, each surrounded by increasingly unsuitable terrain. Populations that had once moved freely across connected habitats found themselves confined to scattered refuges, each functioning like an ecological island. For creatures tied closely to humid environments, this fragmentation carried lasting consequences. Arthropleura occupied forests rich in decaying vegetation where moisture remained high throughout the year. As suitable habitat became increasingly restricted, its range contracted as well. Populations grew more isolated from one another, reducing opportunities for expansion across the landscape. The largest animals on the forest floor gradually became inhabitants of shrinking sanctuaries, surrounded by environments that no longer supported their way of life. At nearly the same time, another transformation unfolded high above the surface. Atmospheric oxygen began a prolonged decline from the exceptional concentrations that had characterized the Carboniferous. The change did not happen abruptly. Across millions of years, the atmosphere slowly moved away from the conditions that had raised the respiratory limits of giant insects. The ceiling that had permitted extraordinary body sizes steadily lowered, narrowing the range of forms that could be supported with the same efficiency. Even so, the fossil record reveals an unexpected resilience. Griffinflies did not vanish as soon as oxygen began to fall. Meganeura permiana survived into the early Permian period, around 280 million years ago, long after atmospheric conditions had begun shifting away from their earlier peak. These enormous aerial predators continued to occupy the skies despite living under oxygen levels that, according to the simplest model, should already have limited such immense bodies. That persistence carries considerable scientific importance. If oxygen alone determined maximum insect size, giant forms should have declined much more rapidly once atmospheric concentrations dropped. Instead, they remained present across an interval that extended well beyond the beginning of environmental change. Their continued existence suggests that additional forces help sustain gigantism. The absence of agile vertebrate hunters in the air, established ecological relationships, and the gradual pace of evolutionary change likely allowed these lineages to endure longer than oxygen levels alone would predict. For this reason, the giant insects of the Permian occupy a distinctive place within the fossil record. Their bodies appear unexpectedly large for the atmosphere they inhabited, standing slightly outside the pattern that had previously linked oxygen and size so closely. They represent one of the earliest hints that the story might be more complicated than a single environmental explanation. The Permian period itself eventually drew to a catastrophic close, approximately 252 million years ago, with the greatest mass extinction known in Earth's history. An estimated 96% of marine species and 70% of land species disappeared during that event. By then, Arthropleura had already vanished from the forests it once crossed. The great griffinflies survived longer, yet they also disappeared before the world settled into its next chapter, leaving behind a fading record of giants whose decline had begun well before the final catastrophe arrived. Recovery after the Permian extinction unfolded across spans of time almost impossible to picture. Ecosystems did not spring back in a single burst. Through the Triassic period, beginning around 252 million years ago and continuing until approximately 201 million years ago, life slowly assembled itself from the survivors. Forests returned in new forms. Food webs expanded once more, and insects diversified into fresh lineages descended from those that had endured the greatest biological crisis in Earth's history. These insects entered a planet that no longer resembled the one their distant ancestors had known. Atmospheric oxygen continued to fluctuate, falling below earlier levels before beginning another gradual climb toward concentrations more familiar today. According to the pattern established by 150 million years of fossil evidence, maximum insect size should have responded in step with those atmospheric changes. Lower oxygen should have restricted size, while rising oxygen should eventually have allowed larger forms to return. The extensive collection of fossil wing measurements, assembled by Matthew Clapham and Jared Carr, revealed something far more intriguing. During the Triassic period, the largest insects remained somewhat smaller than expected, even after accounting for the reduced oxygen available at the time. The difference was not dramatic enough to overturn the established relationship, yet it appeared consistently enough to attract attention. A subtle mismatch had entered a pattern that previously behaved with remarkable precision. That small discrepancy carries considerable weight. Scientific explanations often begin with tiny departures from expectation rather than spectacular contradictions. Here, the departure suggested that atmospheric chemistry might no longer be acting alone. Another influence, still weak and difficult to identify, seemed to be placing additional limits on how large flying insects could become. The signal remained faint, almost easy to overlook, yet it marked the first indication that biology itself was beginning to compete with the atmosphere as a controlling force. As Earth entered the Jurassic period, oxygen gradually increased once again. Earlier sections of the fossil record had established a dependable expectation for such conditions. Larger bodies should have become more common as respiratory constraints relaxed. The insects responded only partially. Maximum sizes rose far less than the oxygen trend predicted, producing another inconsistency that accumulated alongside the earlier Triassic anomaly. Viewed individually, each deviation might have seemed insignificant. Examined together across millions of years, however, they formed a pattern of their own. The once dependable partnership between oxygen and insect size had begun to loosen. Atmospheric conditions still mattered, yet they no longer explained every change preserved within the fossil record. Then the evidence reached a decisive turning point. Around 140 million to 130 million years ago, near the transition between the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the relationship broke in a way that atmospheric models could not explain. Oxygen levels moved upward, creating conditions that should have favored larger insects. Instead, the maximum sizes recorded in fossils declined sharply. The direction itself had reversed. That reversal transformed the meaning of the entire dataset. For 150 million years, oxygen had served as the strongest predictor of insect size. Suddenly, the prediction failed. The curve that once followed atmospheric change, with remarkable consistency, bent away onto a different path, preserving the signature of a new influence powerful enough to override a rule that had shaped insect evolution since the earliest days of flight. The evidence did not immediately identify the cause. It only established the moment when another force became impossible to ignore. Somewhere near that boundary, in deep time, a biological event emerged with sufficient strength to redirect the history of giant insects, replacing atmospheric dominance with a new evolutionary pressure whose effects would echo through every age that followed. Before the pattern in the fossil record can be understood, another group must enter the sky. Their arrival marked the first time insects shared the air with vertebrates capable of powered flight. They did not immediately overthrow the giants, nor did they erase the long relationship between oxygen and insect size. Even so, they introduced an entirely new kind of presence into an environment that insects had dominated for countless generations. Pterosaurs first evolved during the late Triassic period, approximately 230 million years ago. They became the earliest vertebrates known to achieve true powered flight, reaching the air through an evolutionary path unlike anything before them. Their skeletons were built with lightweight, hollow bones that reduced mass without sacrificing strength. Each wing consisted of a membrane of skin and muscle, supported mainly by an enormously elongated fourth finger, creating a structure very different from the feathered wings that would appear much later. Across the following 160 million years, pterosaurs diversified into an extraordinary range of forms. Some remained relatively small, while others expanded into giants unlike any flying animal alive today. The largest known member of the group, Quetzalcoatlus, eventually reached a wingspan of approximately 10 meters, which is about 33 feet. Such dimensions placed it among the greatest flying creatures Earth has ever produced, demonstrating how successful this lineage became across the Mesozoic skies. For scientists studying insect evolution, an obvious possibility emerged. If giant flying vertebrates had entered the atmosphere, perhaps they had begun hunting oversized insects and driving their gradual decline. Matthew Clapham and Jared Carr examined this idea directly in their comprehensive study of fossil insect wing lengths. They searched the dataset for a clear statistical change that coincided with the appearance and spread of pterosaurs, hoping to determine whether these early flyers had altered the long-established relationship between oxygen and insect size. The results proved surprisingly restrained. Somewhat larger insects remained present during the Triassic than in later periods, suggesting a modest shift after pterosaurs appeared. Interpreting that signal, however, is complicated by two important limitations. The fossil record contains a gap of approximately 20 million years during this interval, reducing the available evidence. At the same time, atmospheric oxygen was also declining, making it difficult to separate environmental influences from biological ones with confidence. When Clapham and Carr compared competing statistical models, the strongest evidence supported only a modest breakpoint near the transition between the Triassic and Jurassic periods. The change existed, yet it remained too weak to conclude that pterosaurs had imposed the kind of overwhelming predation pressure capable of reshaping insect evolution on their own. Atmospheric oxygen still explained much of the variation during this stage. Flight mechanics offer one likely explanation. According to Clapham, pterosaurs probably lacked the aerial agility that later predators would possess. Their membrane wings functioned effectively for sustained flight, soaring, and covering great distances, yet the design offered less capacity for rapid directional changes than another flight system that had not yet evolved. Pursuing agile insects through repeated twists and abrupt turns demanded a level of maneuverability that membrane wings appear to have provided less efficiently. The arrival of pterosaurs therefore marked an important beginning rather than a decisive conclusion. They introduced vertebrate hunters into the air for the first time, adding a fresh ecological pressure that had never before existed. Even so, the fossil record shows that the Great Shift had not yet arrived. Another lineage, still many millions of years in the future, would eventually possess the combination of flight control and hunting ability needed to rewrite the history recorded within those ancient wings. A single body settled into fine limestone mud within the warm lagoons of the Jurassic world, approximately 150 million years ago. Layer after layer of delicate sediment enclosed every feather, claw, and bone with unusual precision. The remains rested undisturbed, while continents shifted, seas retreated, and mountains slowly rose above them. Much later, that preserved skeleton would emerge as one of the most influential fossils ever uncovered. Its discovery came in the year 1861, only a single year after Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The timing gave the specimen extraordinary importance. Here was an animal carrying unmistakable features from two seemingly separate worlds. It possessed the teeth of a small predatory dinosaur, clawed fingers that remained free along the wings, and a long bony tail. Surrounding those unmistakably reptilian traits were fully developed feathers arranged for flight, revealing a remarkable blend of characteristics within one creature. Scientists named it Archaeopteryx lithographica. Today it is recognized as the earliest known member of the bird lineage. 7 accepted specimens have been recovered, all preserved within the Solnhofen limestone of Bavaria in what is now southern Germany. Their exceptional condition has allowed researchers to examine details that would have vanished in almost any other fossil deposit, preserving evidence of muscles, feathers, and the proportions of the wings with remarkable clarity. Modern imaging techniques have continued to reveal new information. Synchrotron microtomography allowed researchers to examine the internal structure of the wing bones without damaging the fossils. Those scans showed that Archaeopteryx possessed bone architecture consistent with active powered flight. It was not designed for prolonged journeys across great distances. Instead, it appears to have relied on vigorous bursts of flapping, much like a modern pheasant crossing open ground or escaping through woodland, with rapid acceleration and abrupt changes in direction. That style of flight represented something the skies had never contained before. Earlier, pterosaurs certainly flew, yet their membrane wings imposed different aerodynamic limits. Feathered wings attached across the arm and hand created a highly responsive surface capable of subtle adjustments during every wing beat. Fine control over lift, drag, and turning allowed these early birds to maneuver with exceptional precision while weaving through branches or pursuing agile prey across short distances. Evidence strongly suggests that insects formed an important part of the diet. The conical teeth of Archaeopteryx were well suited for seizing and holding small animals rather than slicing flesh from large prey. Within the surrounding Jurassic ecosystem lived beetles, flies, cockroaches, earwigs, and many other insects that occupied forests, shorelines, and vegetation bordering the lagoons. A feathered hunter, capable of rapid flight, could exploit those abundant food sources with increasing efficiency. The Solnhofen limestone has revealed another important surprise. Researchers identified a second early bird, known as Alcmonavis poeshli, within the same formation. Its presence indicates that bird diversity during the late Jurassic was greater than once believed. Archaeopteryx was not an isolated experiment in evolution. It belonged to an emerging community of feathered flyers exploring similar ecological opportunities while refining new methods of movement through the air. Viewed alongside the fossil record of insect size, these discoveries acquire deeper significance. The appearance of agile, warm-blooded, feathered aerial predators closely approaches the moment when the long relationship between atmospheric oxygen and maximum insect size begins to fail. Oxygen alone could no longer explain the changing pattern. The skies had gained hunters whose flight combined precision, acceleration, and rapid turning in ways unseen before, transforming an environment that giant insects had dominated across immense stretches of Earth's history. Across thousands of fossil wings collected from different continents and separated by immense spans of geological time, a single pattern emerges with remarkable clarity. For nearly 150 million years, the rise and fall of maximum insect size followed changes in atmospheric oxygen with striking consistency. Then, within the early Cretaceous, that dependable relationship fractured. The change was neither gradual nor ambiguous. It appeared as a distinct turning point preserved within the fossil record itself. The foundation for this conclusion comes from the comprehensive study conducted by Matthew Clapham of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Jared Carr. Their analysis examined 10,500 fossil insect wing lengths gathered from published records spanning hundreds of millions of years. Such a broad collection allowed them to compare insect body size with independently reconstructed atmospheric oxygen levels across deep time, revealing trends impossible to recognize from isolated discoveries. When the researchers reached the interval between approximately 140 million and 130 million years ago, the expected pattern failed. Atmospheric oxygen was rising once again after earlier declines, a condition that previous evidence suggested should have allowed larger insects to flourish. Instead, the largest insects became smaller. Maximum body size decreased while oxygen moved in the opposite direction. That single observation became the pivotal result of the entire investigation. For generations, oxygen had been regarded as the dominant explanation for insect gigantism. The physiological argument was compelling because insects rely on their branching tracheal system to deliver oxygen directly into body tissues. Higher concentrations of atmospheric oxygen supported larger bodies, while lower concentrations imposed stronger limits. The fossil evidence appeared to reinforce that explanation through 150 million years of evolutionary history. Yet the early Cretaceous record demonstrated that another influence had become more powerful than atmospheric chemistry alone. The statistical models reflected this transition with equal clarity. A simple model driven only by oxygen received almost no meaningful support once the complete dataset was analyzed. The model that best matched the fossil evidence contained three distinct phases. The earliest phase showed insect size, tracking atmospheric oxygen from the origin of insects until roughly 140 million years ago. A second phase displayed reduced maximum size between approximately 140 million and 90 million years ago. A third phase revealed another reduction from about 90 million years ago through 65 million years ago and continuing into the age of mammals. Such a sequence required a controlling force capable of overriding physiological opportunity. Clapham and Carr identified the strongest explanation as increasing predation from flying vertebrates, particularly the expanding diversity of birds. Oxygen still influenced biology, yet it no longer dictated the upper boundary of insect size. Selection had acquired a different direction. The mechanism is straightforward when viewed across many generations. Larger insects presented larger targets within open air. They were easier to detect, easier to pursue, and more likely to be captured before producing offspring. Smaller individuals possessed advantages that accumulated over countless breeding cycles. They could change direction more rapidly, disappear into vegetation more effectively, and escape attacks with greater frequency. Every successful escape increased the likelihood that genes favoring reduced size would pass into the next generation. Within the fossil record, this transformation appears as a measurable inflection rather than a gradual fading. A relationship that had endured across 150 million years yielded within a comparatively brief geological interval. The rise of feathered aerial hunters coincided with that decisive shift, marking the moment when the history of insects began following a different evolutionary rule. The turning point did not emerge from chance alone. It arose from principles that govern every object moving through air, from drifting seeds to soaring birds. Once feathered hunters entered the skies in growing numbers, the physical demands of flight began favoring one kind of insect over another. Evolution responded to those demands with unwavering consistency, generation after generation. Matthew Clapham summarized the central idea with striking clarity. The maneuverability of any flying creature scales with size. Smaller flyers change direction more easily than larger ones, because the laws of motion favor lighter bodies with less rotational inertia. Every rapid turn, banking movement, or sudden reversal requires energy to redirect mass. As that mass increases, the effort needed to alter direction rises as well. Physics alone places growing limits on aerial agility. Wing loading contributes to the same challenge. A larger insect carries more weight relative to the area of its wings, demanding broader, slower adjustments to remain stable during flight. Turning radius also expands with increasing size. A giant insect cannot pivot through the air with the same sharp precision as a much smaller relative. Even when both possess strong wings and similar body plans, their responses to sudden pursuit differ because the mechanics governing flight have changed. Imagine two insects sharing the same stretch of forest. One spreads wings, measuring between 20 and 30 centimeters, which is about 8 to nearly 12 inches. The other carries a wingspan of only 5 centimeters, which is about 2 inches. The larger insect presents a broad silhouette that remains visible from farther away. Once airborne, its greater mass resists abrupt changes in direction. The smaller insect darts through tighter paths, reverses course with little warning, and slips between leaves before a pursuer can fully react. For roughly 150 million years after insects first evolved, these differences carried relatively little consequence. The skies contained no hunter capable of consistently exploiting them. Oxygen determined how large insects could become because no equally capable aerial predator existed to transform size into vulnerability. That long balance persisted until feathered flyers introduced a completely different style of pursuit. Birds possessed wings built from overlapping feathers, extending across the arm and hand, creating exceptional aerodynamic control. Minute adjustments along those feathers allowed rapid acceleration, precise braking, and swift changes in direction while maintaining stability. Earlier, pterosaurs mastered powered flight through a different design, yet membrane wings stretched from an elongated finger offered less fine control during rapid aerial maneuvers. Birds entered the air with an entirely new level of responsiveness. Energy further strengthened this selective pressure. A single large insect contained far more nourishment than several tiny ones. Every successful capture rewarded the hunter with substantially greater calories while requiring only one pursuit. Birds competing for food naturally benefited from targeting the largest insects they could reliably catch. Large prey became attractive for practical reasons, grounded in energy gained compared with effort spent. Natural selection gradually amplified that imbalance. Individuals carrying genes for smaller bodies escaped attacks more often and survived long enough to reproduce. Those producing exceptionally large offspring lost descendants whenever predators removed them before breeding. Across thousands of generations, each successful escape nudged average body size downward. Evolution required no intention and offered no exceptions. Giant insect lineages, unable to shrink rapidly enough, or unable to evolve compensating agility despite their size, steadily disappeared from the fossil record, leaving behind descendants shaped as much by the mathematics of flight as by the biology of inheritance. Extinction tells only part of the story. Across the forests of the early Cretaceous, another process unfolded at the same time, one written not in disappearance but in adaptation. Every successful escape carried the possibility of inheritance. Every failed pursuit left descendants to refine another generation. Predator and prey became participants in an evolutionary contest that neither could abandon, each advance by one inviting a response from the other. Evidence for that contest emerged in a study published during 2024 in Science Advances. Researchers examined the family Paleontonidae, giant cicada-like insects that flourished through much of the Jurassic before surviving into the early Cretaceous. Their fossils preserve details of wing shape with remarkable clarity, allowing comparisons across millions of years. Those comparisons revealed that the transition from the latest Jurassic into the earliest Cretaceous was accompanied by a pronounced faunal turnover. Older forms declined, while new species carrying distinctly different wing designs became increasingly common. Those differences extended beyond appearance alone. The newer insects possessed wing geometry associated with greater flight efficiency, higher speed, and substantially improved maneuverability. Their proportions shifted in measurable ways that would have allowed tighter turns and more responsive movement through the air. Such changes appeared during the same interval when feathered birds diversified into expanding ecological roles. The timing placed two evolutionary stories on precisely the same stage. The investigators concluded that this transformation was stimulated by the rise of early birds, supporting the idea of an aerial evolutionary arms race. The changing wings of Paleontonidae reflected more than ordinary variation. They represented anatomical responses to repeated encounters with increasingly capable hunters. Every generation inherited slight differences. Individuals better able to evade pursuit survived more often, leaving descendants that carried those advantageous traits forward. Across geological time, countless small victories accumulated into an unmistakable redesign. Only a limited number of paths remained available. Some lineages responded by becoming smaller, lighter, and more agile, exchanging enormous bodies for quicker reactions. Others refined wing proportions that favored faster acceleration and sharper directional changes. Survival increasingly depended upon escaping attacks that had once been impossible. Species unable to alter their bodies rapidly enough gradually vanished, their histories ending within layers of stone, while their adaptable relatives continued onward. Viewed across millions of years, these changes occurred with surprising speed. Geological time often appears immeasurably slow from a human perspective, yet natural selection can reshape populations rapidly whenever survival depends upon a single repeated challenge. The fossil record preserves that directional pressure. Instead of random fluctuations, successive species display coordinated anatomical shifts pointing toward the same outcome. Evolution followed a consistent course because the selective force remained consistent. The story therefore changes in a fundamental way. The disappearance of giant insects cannot be understood as a simple consequence of changing air or climate alone. They inhabited a world where pursuit had acquired unprecedented precision. Every improvement in avian flight altered the conditions under which insects lived, fed, and reproduced. Those capable of matching the challenge endured by transforming themselves. Those that remained bound to older designs gradually passed from the living world, leaving descendants whose smaller bodies carried the memory of that long contest through every beating wing that still crosses the sky today. A clearer picture begins to emerge when the earlier flyers are placed beside the newcomers. Both occupied the sky, both possessed powered flight, and both encountered the same insect communities. Yet the fossil record preserves two very different outcomes. One group left only a faint mark upon the history of insect size. The other reshaped that history within a comparatively brief geological interval. The difference rested in the design of their wings, the style of their flight, and the ecological role they came to occupy. Pterosaurs relied upon a flight membrane stretched across an enormously elongated fourth finger. That arrangement produced a broad aerodynamic surface capable of generating impressive lift. Some species crossed immense distances, while later giants reached wingspans approaching 10 meters, which is about 33 feet. Such construction favored efficient travel through open air and sustained flight over considerable ranges. Modern aerodynamic analyses indicate that this architecture was less suited to rapid acceleration, abrupt banking, and repeated directional changes required for pursuing agile insects through dense vegetation or across cluttered woodland spaces. Birds inherited an entirely different solution. Their wings consisted of feathers anchored along the arm and hand, forming a flexible surface that could change shape from one wing beat to the next. Individual feathers adjusted independently as air flowed across them, allowing subtle corrections throughout flight. Each stroke could alter lift, drag, and balance almost instantly. This gave birds exceptional control during sharp turns, steep climbs, sudden braking, and rapid pursuit, qualities that transformed aerial hunting into something far more precise than membrane wings could usually accomplish. The comparison preserved by the fossil record carries unusual strength because it resembles a natural experiment repeated across deep time. Pterosaurs remained part of Earth's ecosystems for roughly 160 million years, yet the statistical signal associated with declining insect size during their rise remains limited. Once birds diversified, the relationship changed abruptly. The dataset tracing fossil insect wings reveals a decisive reduction in maximum size that aligns with the spread of feathered aerial hunters. The contrast between these two intervals is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Matthew Clapham summarized this distinction in straightforward terms, explaining that pterosaurs may not have been as agile or maneuverable in flight as birds. That interpretation fits naturally with the aerodynamic evidence. A predator, unable to match every twist and turn of its prey, will capture fewer individuals. One capable of adjusting its flight path within fractions of a second steadily increases its success. Across countless generations, those differences accumulate into evolutionary pressure acting upon every surviving insect population. Ecology reinforced those mechanical advantages. Many pterosaurs exploited a broad menu that included fish, small vertebrates, carrion, and larger insects, depending upon the species. Early birds entered ecosystems as comparatively small hunters whose bodies and flight style positioned them directly among insects occupying the same airspace. Giant dragonfly relatives and feathered hunters often pursued similar prey, creating competition as well as predation. Reporting on the study by National Geographic highlighted this additional pressure, suggesting birds reduced giant insects not only by catching them, but also by competing for the smaller insects upon which many depended for survival. Together, these forces formed a far more complete challenge than pterosaurs had ever presented. Feathered predators altered both the danger of being large and the availability of food, leaving giant insects with fewer evolutionary paths and steadily narrowing the skies they had once dominated. Change did not pause after the first feathered hunters entered the sky. Across the Cretaceous, stretching from approximately 145 million years ago until 66 million years ago, bird evolution gathered momentum. New forms appeared, occupied fresh ecological roles, and refined the mechanics of flight generation after generation. The transformation unfolded over tens of millions of years, yet each improvement carried consequences for every insect sharing the same air. The earliest representatives of the bird lineage still retained unmistakable traces of their dinosaur ancestry. Archaeopteryx possessed teeth within its jaws and clawed fingers projecting from its wings, while its flight remained limited to short bursts of powered flapping. Those abilities were enough to leave the ground and pursue prey among branches or across open clearings, but they represented only the beginning of a much longer evolutionary journey. Successive bird lineages gradually discarded older anatomical features while developing bodies increasingly specialized for life in the air. By the late Cretaceous, that diversity had expanded dramatically. Some birds remained small, toothed flyers moving through forests and along shorelines. Others became accomplished divers resembling modern loons in overall lifestyle, propelling themselves through water after fish. Additional groups already displayed characteristics associated with the ancestors of many living bird lineages. The skies no longer belonged to a handful of experimental forms. They contained an expanding community of specialized hunters occupying different habitats, feeding strategies, and flight styles. The most significant advances occurred within the machinery powering each wing beat. Enlarged pectoral muscles supplied greater force during flight, while the skeleton became increasingly adapted to repeated flapping. A fully enclosed trioceal canal evolved, forming the passage through which the tendon responsible for raising the wing could operate with greater efficiency. Wing surfaces also became more refined, giving birds finer control over lift, balance, and rapid adjustments during pursuit. Each anatomical improvement translated directly into greater agility in the air. Matthew Clapham summarized this progression with striking simplicity, observing that the earliest birds were not especially skilled flyers, whereas birds living by the end of the Cretaceous looked much more like those familiar today. That gradual refinement carried profound ecological consequences. Every improvement in acceleration, turning ability, and controlled braking narrowed the options available to large flying insects. Escape demanded increasingly sophisticated aerial performance from prey that had already begun shrinking under earlier selective pressure. The fossil dataset records this continuing pressure with remarkable clarity. Following the first major reduction in maximum insect size after birds appeared, a second distinct decline occurred between approximately 90 million years ago and 65 million years ago. This interval corresponds closely with the emergence of increasingly modern avian anatomy. The timing suggests that the growing effectiveness of bird flight intensified selection against large insects instead of merely maintaining earlier trends. Taken together, these two episodes reveal an extended process rather than a single evolutionary moment. Predation pressure strengthened as birds themselves evolved, adding new layers of difficulty for oversized insects with every improvement in aerial performance. Greater speed, tighter turning, sharper control, and expanding ecological diversity steadily removed opportunities that giant insects had once relied upon. Across millions of years, the sky became progressively less forgiving until bodies shaped for an earlier world could no longer keep pace with predators whose wings had become instruments of extraordinary precision. Darkness had long offered flying insects a different rhythm of life. After daylight hunters settled into their routines, countless wings still crossed the evening air with far fewer vertebrate predators to avoid. That balance endured for millions of years until another lineage entered the sky. Around approximately 55 million years ago to 52 million years ago, after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction had reshaped ecosystems across Earth, mammals achieved something no other mammals had managed before. Bats became the second great wave of aerial vertebrate hunters. The earliest known fossil bat, Onychnicteris finii, already possessed fully developed wings capable of powered flight. Although its hearing structures suggest echolocation may still have been in an early stage or absent, true flight had already evolved. Soon afterward, later bat lineages combined powered flight with sophisticated echolocation, producing a hunting strategy unlike anything that had previously existed. Birds ruled the daylight hours through vision, while bats mastered conditions where eyesight alone offered little advantage. Echolocation transformed darkness into a landscape rich with information. Bats emitted ultrasonic sound pulses that spread through the air before returning as echoes from leaves, branches, and moving prey. Those returning signals revealed direction, distance, and movement with remarkable precision. Flying insects that had depended on the cover of night suddenly found themselves tracked by predators, able to detect even slight changes in position without relying on visible light. A refuge that had persisted across immense spans of geological time became steadily less dependable. This development completed a profound ecological transition. Birds remained dominant during daylight, while bats expanded across the hours after sunset and before dawn. Between them, nearly every period of sustained insect activity now overlapped with highly capable vertebrate hunters. The atmosphere itself had not changed in any meaningful way to force this shift. The pressure came from living competitors whose senses, flight abilities, and hunting strategies continued improving across successive generations. Matthew Clapham identified bats as one likely contributor to the continued reduction in maximum insect size during the later stages of the fossil record, extending into the Cenozoic era. Although the evidence remains less direct, than the evidence linking birds to the earlier decline. Fossil preservation becomes less complete for this interval, making precise statistical relationships more difficult to establish. Even so, the broader evolutionary pattern aligns with the arrival of nocturnal aerial predators capable of targeting insects that had previously escaped daytime pursuit. Insects did not remain unchanged. Some large moth lineages evolved ears capable of detecting the ultrasonic calls produced by hunting bats. Those organs allowed the insects to recognize approaching predators and respond with rapid evasive maneuvers before physical contact occurred. In several modern groups, this sensory adaptation continues to shape survival every evening, preserving evidence of an evolutionary contest that began tens of millions of years ago. The struggle echoed the earlier responses that flying insects had already developed while adapting to increasingly agile birds. Viewed across the full sweep of Earth's history, the pattern forms a continuous narrative. Giant insects first flourished under atmospheric conditions that favored exceptional size. Feathered hunters then reshaped the daylight sky, and flying mammals extended comparable pressure across the hours of darkness. Every major interval of aerial activity now contained predators capable of exploiting the physical disadvantages carried by oversized insects. The remaining lineages endured by becoming smaller, quicker, and more responsive, leaving the age of giant wings as a memory preserved within stone. The final chapter did not begin with wings or with changing air. It arrived from space. Around 66 million years ago, an asteroid measuring about 10 kilometers, which is about 6.2 miles across, struck the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact excavated the structure, now called the Chicxulub crater, and unleashed one of the greatest biological upheavals in Earth's history. Fire spread across landscapes. Enormous earthquakes rippled through continents. Towering waves crossed oceans, and dust filled the atmosphere until sunlight faded for an extended period. The fifth great mass extinction had begun. Life that had already endured millions of years of evolutionary pressure now faced an entirely different challenge. Non-avian dinosaurs disappeared from the planet. Pterosaurs, whose long history in the skies had already been drawing toward its end, vanished completely. Across land and sea, roughly 75% of all known species were lost. Food webs fractured as plants declined, herbivores disappeared, and predators followed. The living world contracted into scattered survivors capable of enduring months and years of profound ecological instability. Birds suffered enormous losses as well, yet several lineages endured. Their comparatively small bodies, flexible diets, and capacity for sustained powered flight helped some populations survive where larger animals could not. Once conditions gradually improved, those surviving birds expanded into habitats left vacant by extinct reptiles. Forests, wetlands, shorelines, and open plains slowly filled with new forms descended from a remarkably small collection of ancestors. Evolution accelerated through opportunity as much as through survival, reshaping ecosystems that had been emptied by catastrophe. For insects, the extinction marked the closing movement of a much longer story. Giant species had already been declining through millions of years of increasingly effective aerial predation. Their numbers had diminished as birds became more agile and as other vertebrate hunters spread across both daylight and darkness. The asteroid did not begin that process. It arrived after much of the evolutionary work had already been done. Ecosystems that might once have supported exceptionally large flying insects now collapsed under environmental stress, removing many of the remaining circumstances in which gigantism could still persist. Recovery unfolded across the newly forming Cenozoic era. Birds diversified into ecological roles previously occupied by non avian dinosaurs, expanding through forests, grasslands, wetlands, mountains, and coastlines. Insects also rebounded with extraordinary diversity, though the survivors largely belonged to smaller, quicker lineages whose bodies matched the demands of the transformed world. Their descendants flourished in immense numbers, filling nearly every habitat on Earth while rarely approaching the dimensions once common among their distant relatives. The fossil record preserves this transition with striking consistency. The extensive data set, tracing more than 10,500 fossil insect wings, identifies another stable phase, beginning at or after the boundary between the Cretaceous period and the Cenozoic era. Maximum insect size remained distinctly lower than during much of the Mesozoic era. Even as life diversified once again, the pattern reflects permanence rather than temporary disruption. A world rebuilt after extinction, settled around different biological limits than those that had existed before. Seen across hundreds of millions of years, the disappearance of giant insects was never the consequence of a single disaster. Atmospheric change first shaped opportunity. Aerial predators steadily narrowed it, and global catastrophe removed the last fragile remnants. When forests, rivers, and skies filled with life once more, the future belonged to resilient survivors whose smaller wings carried them into an entirely different age. Sometimes the most important discovery is not a fossil lifted from stone, but a pattern that only appears after thousands of separate discoveries are brought together. Every preserved wing, collected from different continents, different rock layers, and different generations of scientific work, carried only a fragment of the larger story. Viewed alone, each specimen revealed the shape of a single insect. Viewed together, they became a record of evolution stretching across hundreds of millions of years. At the heart of this research stands a remarkable dataset containing more than 10,500 fossil insect wing measurements. Jared Carr assembled these data through an extensive review of published paleontological literature, drawing information from studies produced over many decades. Matthew Clapham later remarked that gathering the material had been a laborious task, reflecting the patience required to locate, compare, and standardize observations scattered throughout countless scientific publications. The achievement rested not upon one spectacular excavation, but upon careful persistence across an enormous body of previous research. Wing length served as the essential measurement because wings survive far more readily than delicate body tissues. Complete insect fossils remain uncommon across much of the geological record, while isolated wings are comparatively abundant. Their dimensions provide a dependable proxy for overall body size, allowing researchers to compare insects separated by immense spans of time even when only partial remains exist. A single preserved wing therefore becomes more than an isolated fragment. It functions as a consistent measuring stick, linking organisms that never shared the same world. The completed dataset extends from the Devonian period, when the earliest winged insects first appeared, through the entire Cenozoic era. Hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history become visible within one analytical framework. That extraordinary continuity allowed the investigators to compare changes in maximum insect size with independent reconstructions of atmospheric oxygen across equivalent intervals. The resulting graphs revealed a relationship that remained strong for an immense duration before changing with surprising clarity. Without such temporal breadth, that turning point would have blended into ordinary variation and passed unnoticed. The publication that presented these findings carried a title that reflected its central conclusion with remarkable precision. environmental and biotic controls on the evolutionary history of insect body size. Those words describe two different forces acting across different ages of Earth. Environmental influences, especially atmospheric oxygen, governed the earliest history of insect gigantism. Later, biological interactions, particularly predation from increasingly capable flying vertebrates, became the dominant influence. The transition emerged from the evidence itself, instead of being imposed upon it beforehand. The statistical evaluation strengthened that interpretation. Among the competing explanations, the three-phase model received an Akaike weight of approximately 0.74, indicating substantially stronger support than alternative models. The simpler explanation relying upon atmospheric oxygen alone received a weight approaching zero, demonstrating that it no longer accounted for the observed pattern. Once later, geological intervals were included. The data therefore favored a history shaped first by environmental conditions and later by ecological interactions operating across successive evolutionary stages. This is how science often advances. Thousands of measurements gathered by many researchers become a foundation upon which a new question can finally be asked. The answer does not emerge through spectacle. It appears when scattered observations are assembled with care until an invisible pattern gradually comes into view, revealing that the history of giant insects was written not by a single cause, but by changing forces unfolding across deep time. Imagine the history of life unfolding once more, with every continent still shifting, every forest still spreading, every season still returning, except for one missing branch of evolution. Feathered flyers never appear. The sky remains occupied by other creatures, yet none possess the same combination of speed, precision, and sustained aerial control. From that single difference, countless other changes begin to emerge across the living world. The research by Matthew Clapham and Jared Carr carries an implication that reaches beyond the fossil record itself. If birds had never evolved, insects living today would almost certainly be much larger than the forms familiar to us. This conclusion does not arise from imaginative storytelling. It follows from the pattern contained within the fossil data. Before birds became widespread, maximum insect size closely tracked changes in atmospheric oxygen. After birds expanded through the skies during the early Cretaceous, that relationship broke apart. Predation replaced atmospheric chemistry as the dominant influence, limiting the upper boundary of insect size. Without that biological pressure, the earlier relationship would likely have continued through the remaining history of the Cretaceous period and into the Cenozoic era. Modern air contains about 21% oxygen. That concentration remains lower than the Carboniferous peak, which reached roughly between 31% and 35%, yet it is still sufficient to support insects considerably larger than those commonly seen today. The atmosphere alone does not forbid greater size. The evidence suggests another force has been enforcing that limit for well over 100 million years. A comparison between living and fossil insects illustrates the scale of that difference. Among the largest dragonflies alive today is the giant hawker of Southeast Asia and Australia, whose wingspan reaches approximately 16 centimeters, which is about 6.3 inches. Far earlier in Earth's history, the famous giant dragonfly, relative known as Meganeura, possessed a wingspan close to 70 centimeters, that is about 27.6 inches. Even allowing for lower modern oxygen, the fossil evidence suggests that, without sustained aerial predation from birds, insects substantially larger than today's species would probably still occupy many environments. This thought experiment reveals an important lesson about evolutionary limits. The boundaries shaping life do not emerge only from chemistry, gravity, or the physical properties of living tissue. They also arise through encounters between organisms. Every successful adaptation alters the conditions experienced by countless other species. A new predator changes the value of speed. A more agile hunter transforms the usefulness of size. Evolution, therefore, becomes a dialogue among living lineages, with each participant reshaping the possibilities available to the others. Remove birds from that dialogue, and familiar landscapes begin to change in subtle but meaningful ways. The insects visiting flowers, crossing rivers, or circling forest canopies would belong to different evolutionary histories. Food webs would follow different pathways. Countless interactions among predators, pollinators, and plants would unfold according to altered rules established long before humanity appeared. The sky itself would remain full of motion, yet its balance would reflect another history entirely, reminding us that birds did far more than enter an empty realm. Across deep time, they transformed the conditions under which every flying insect thereafter evolved. A dragonfly drifting above a pond can appear untouched by deep time. Its transparent wings shimmer with familiar precision. Its flight seems effortless, and its sudden changes of direction unfold in moments too brief for the eye to fully follow. Yet within that compact body rests a history stretching across hundreds of millions of years, linking living insects with relatives that once ruled skies no bird had yet claimed. Modern dragonflies belong to the order Odonata. They occupy much the same ecological role once filled by the famous griffinflies, although the relationship is more distant than it first appears. The griffinflies, placed within the separate and now extinct lineage called Meganeura, were close relatives rather than direct ancestors. Their family tree branched away long ago, leaving modern dragonflies as surviving representatives of a broader evolutionary heritage rather than descendants of any single giant species. Many of the defining features remain recognizable across that immense span of time. Large compound eyes wrap around much of the head, providing nearly 360-degree vision. Specialized legs fold together into a basket-like structure that captures prey during flight with remarkable efficiency. Hunting takes place almost entirely in the air, where speed and precision determine success. Their lives also continue to begin in fresh water, where aquatic larvae spend months or even years before climbing into open air for the final transformation into winged adults. Across changing continents and shifting climates, these fundamental traits endured. Their proportions, however, tell another story. Meganeura approached a wingspan of roughly 70 centimeters, which is about 27.6 inches. The largest living dragonflies reach only about 19 centimeters, which is about 7.5 inches. More than 80% of that impressive span has disappeared through evolutionary time. The reduction reflects far more than changing appearance. It marks a transformation in the balance between survival and vulnerability, preserving bodies that could respond more effectively to increasingly capable aerial hunters. Living dragonflies now rank among the most accomplished flyers in the insect world. They can hover with remarkable stability, accelerate in an instant, reverse direction, move sideways, and pivot through tight turns while keeping prey within sight. Studies measuring hunting performance estimate that successful captures occur in roughly 95% of attacks, placing dragonflies among the most effective predators known. Their mastery of flight comes from finely coordinated wing movements, rapid visual processing, and bodies shaped for continuous aerial adjustment. Those abilities represent the accumulated outcome of more than 150 million years of evolutionary pressure. As birds became faster and more maneuverable, dragonflies that could react more quickly gained a greater chance of surviving long enough to reproduce. Across countless generations, every improvement in turning ability, acceleration, and flight control became another contribution to the lineage. Whenever a modern dragonfly twists away from the path of an approaching bird, it expresses adaptations refined through an ancient contest that reshaped both hunter and prey. Seen in this light, the dragonfly above the water becomes more than an elegant insect. It carries within its anatomy the enduring record of one of Earth's longest evolutionary struggles. Its smaller frame reflects survival instead of decline, while its astonishing aerial skill preserves the legacy of countless ancestors that adapted as the skies themselves changed. The giants disappeared, yet their story continues each time living wings flash across the surface of a pond. Every piece of coal carries a fragment of a vanished landscape. Long before it warmed homes, powered engines, or fueled factories, it existed as living tissue beneath towering swamp forests, where insects drifted through humid air and enormous arthropods crossed waterlogged ground. Those ancient ecosystems disappeared from the surface, yet their remains endured, compressed within layers of rock until another age uncovered them. The Carboniferous period received its name from this extraordinary abundance of coal. The word traces back to the Latin term carbo, meaning coal, reflecting the immense deposits formed during that chapter of Earth's history. Across tropical wetlands, towering lycopsid trees, giant horsetails, seed ferns, and other vegetation grew in extraordinary abundance. When these plants died, they often fell into saturated ground where decay proceeded only incompletely. Layer upon layer accumulated across immense spans of time, gradually buried beneath sediment, heat, and pressure until living forests became coal seams extending beneath continents. Those forests created far more than future fuel. They transformed the atmosphere itself. Through photosynthesis, vast quantities of carbon became locked inside trunks, stems, roots, and leaves, while oxygen accumulated in the air above. Because so much plant material escaped complete decomposition, carbon remained buried instead of rapidly returning to the atmosphere. The result was an interval, during which oxygen reached concentrations unlike those of the present day, supporting biological possibilities that later vanished. Within those forests lived the remarkable giants whose story has unfolded across this journey. Enormous griffinflies crossed open spaces between towering vegetation. Giant millipedes navigated damp forest floors covered with fallen plant matter. Countless smaller arthropods occupied bark, branches, pools, and decaying logs. Generation after generation completed its life within landscapes that ultimately became part of the same geological deposits. Their bodies, together with leaves, spores, wood, and countless other organic remains, entered sediments that slowly hardened into the rocks now mined across the world. A remarkable symmetry appears when these connections are viewed across deep time. The oxygen-rich atmosphere that allowed giant insects to flourish emerged largely because those forests continuously released oxygen while storing carbon beneath expanding wetlands. Hundreds of millions of years later, human civilization began extracting the compressed remains of those same forests. Burning coal returned enormous quantities of long-buried carbon to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, gradually altering atmospheric composition once again through an entirely different process. The relationship stretches across roughly 300 million years, linking two distant worlds through a single continuous chain of cause and consequence. Forests changed the atmosphere and helped shape giant insects. Those forests became coal through geological time. Coal later fueled industrial development on a global scale, reshaping climate, ecosystems, and atmospheric chemistry. The beginning and the end of that sequence remain separated by an almost unimaginable span of time, yet each stage follows naturally from the one before it. Seen together, the Carboniferous landscape and the modern industrial world become chapters of the same enduring story. Air, forests, insects, rock, and atmosphere remain connected across ages that no individual creature could ever witness. At one end of that chain, giant wings crossed skies without feathered rivals. At the other, the buried memory of those forests continues influencing the planet, reminding us that Earth's history does not vanish when an age comes to an end. It continues, transformed into the foundation of another. Viewed from a greater distance, the disappearance of giant insects becomes more than the history of a single group of animals. The fossil record begins to reveal a broader principle, one that reaches beyond dragonflies, griffinflies, or any particular lineage. Across deep time, evolution responds not only to the physical world surrounding life, but also to the living world that organisms create for one another. For many years, atmospheric chemistry seemed to provide the complete explanation for changing insect size. Oxygen concentrations rose, insects grew larger. Oxygen declined, maximum size fell. The relationship appeared elegant and dependable across an immense span of geological history. Physical conditions such as climate, temperature, and atmospheric composition have long been regarded as the dominant influences governing broad evolutionary patterns because they affect every organism sharing the environment. The insect record initially supported that interpretation with remarkable consistency. The full fossil dataset, however, revealed something unexpected. Once birds expanded into aerial ecosystems, the earlier patterns ceased to predict reality. Atmospheric oxygen remained capable of supporting substantially larger insects than those appearing in later fossil deposits. Yet maximum body size continued declining. The controlling influence had shifted. A biological interaction became stronger than the atmospheric condition that had previously guided the same evolutionary trend for well over 100 million years. That conclusion carries significance, extending well beyond insects themselves. It demonstrates that a predator lineage possessing sufficient agility, hunting efficiency, and evolutionary persistence can redirect the future of another lineage within a comparatively brief geological interval. The change does not require alterations in gravity, atmospheric chemistry, or planetary climate. It emerges through the cumulative effect of survival and reproduction, repeated generation after generation until inherited characteristics follow an entirely different path. Predators therefore occupy a more active role in evolutionary history than simple consumers of prey. They influence which individuals survive long enough to reproduce and which inherited traits continue into future populations. Over millions of years, those repeated choices reshape anatomy, behavior, and ecological strategy. The arrival of birds during the Jurassic period did far more than reduce the number of giant insects. Their continued success redirected the evolutionary trajectory of flying insects for the remainder of Earth's history, favoring bodies capable of faster reactions, tighter maneuvering, and greater survival within increasingly contested skies. Comparable patterns have been proposed elsewhere in the history of life. The evolution of large mammalian carnivores has been linked to changing body sizes and defensive strategies among herbivorous mammals. The appearance of whales altered marine food webs, influencing the distribution and ecology of many fish populations. Human expansion has likewise reshaped the history of numerous large animals across several continents. These examples suggest that successful predators can become architects of long term evolutionary change rather than temporary participants within ecological communities. The insect record contributes something unusually valuable to that broader understanding. Here, the transition can be traced through a detailed and carefully assembled body of evidence extending across hundreds of millions of years. The change from atmospheric control to biological control appears within a measurable sequence instead of remaining an abstract idea. It identifies the moment when one evolutionary force yielded to another, demonstrating that life's history is written through constant interaction between physical conditions and living organisms. The atmosphere established the possibilities, yet the hunters ultimately determined which possibilities endured. With the evidence now assembled across hundreds of millions of years, the disappearance of Earth's largest insects no longer appears as a single event. It unfolded through three distinct chapters, each driven by a different force. Together they formed a continuous sequence that gradually dismantled the conditions, allowing aerial and terrestrial giants to flourish. The pattern resembles a long descent, marked by changing pressures instead of one sudden ending. The first phase began during the later Carboniferous period and continued into the Permian period, stretching from roughly 305 million years ago to about 252 million years ago. Atmospheric oxygen declined from its extraordinary peak, while immense coal forests, fragmented as climate shifted, and wet landscapes gave way to drier environments. Organisms tied to those forests lost both favorable air and dependable habitat. The giant millipede, called Arthropleura, disappeared during this interval, reflecting the combined effects of shrinking forests and changing atmospheric chemistry. Flying giants proved more resilient. Griffinflies continued across this transition, surviving longer than an oxygen-driven explanation alone would predict. Their persistence hinted that another influence had not yet entered the story. A different pattern emerged during the second phase, centered between roughly 140 million years ago and 130 million years ago. Birds expanded through the skies with steadily improving flight abilities, and the fossil record recorded a remarkable shift. Atmospheric oxygen was no longer sufficient to predict maximum insect size. The long-standing relationship dissolved as large flying insects encountered increasingly agile vertebrate hunters. Evolution answered by favoring smaller bodies, sharper maneuvering, and quicker reactions. Some groups, including the family known as Paleontinidae, persisted through reduced size and altered flight performance. Other lineages disappeared entirely. The pressure driving change had become biological, acting through survival instead of atmospheric composition. The third phase extended from roughly 90 million years ago through 65 million years ago and continued into the early part of the Cenozoic era. Birds acquired flight mechanics approaching those of living species, increasing their precision in pursuit. Soon afterward, bats entered the night sky, adding a new group of airborne predators that hunted with echolocation in darkness. The remaining hours that had once offered relief from daytime hunters became active hunting periods as well. Near the close of the Cretaceous period, the asteroid impact that struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula within an area about 10 kilometers across, which is about 6.2 miles, triggered global ecological collapse. Any surviving giant insect lineages faced catastrophe after enduring millions of years of mounting evolutionary pressure. The insects rebuilding afterward emerged from smaller, more resilient survivors, establishing the permanently reduced size pattern that continues today. Each phase, therefore, reflects a separate controlling force. The first arose from physical changes affecting atmosphere and habitat. The second and third were driven primarily by predators, reshaping evolutionary possibilities across generation after generation. Together, they formed a cascading process rather than a single extinction. By the opening of the Cenozoic era, the aerial world once occupied by griffinflies had become entirely different. Flight belonged to faster bodies, tighter turns, and relentless pursuit from daylight through darkness. The transformation unfolded gradually across 150 million years, leaving behind a sky that remembered its former rulers only through fossils and the enduring logic preserved within the living descendants that still cross the air today. Some endings leave descendants to carry their shape into another age. This one did not. The griffinflies vanished completely. Every species, every genus, and every family within the order known as Meganeura disappeared from Earth. Their immense wings no longer crossed any sky, and no surviving branch continued their lineage into the present. The insects that now patrol ponds and rivers may resemble them from a distance, yet resemblance is not ancestry. Modern dragonflies belong to the order Odonata, a related lineage that endured while the true griffinflies reached an absolute conclusion. The same finality surrounds Arthropleura. For millions of years, this enormous relative of modern millipedes traveled across swamp forests that no longer exist. Then its order, Arthropleuridae, ended entirely. No living forest shelters its descendants. No hidden valley preserves a lingering population. The evolutionary branch itself was cut away, leaving nothing capable of continuing the story. Life often reshapes old forms into new ones, yet some chapters close so completely that every future generation must begin from different ancestors. Natural history contains rare occasions when apparent endings prove incomplete. The coelacanth offers one famous example. For many decades, scientists believed that remarkable fish had disappeared roughly 65 million years ago, only for living individuals to be discovered during the year 1938. Such rediscoveries remind us that the fossil record can remain unfinished for long stretches of time. Griffinflies belong to another category altogether. Their disappearance is supported by extensive fossil evidence spanning immense intervals, followed by complete absence through every younger rock layer examined across the world. Their reign itself makes that absence especially striking. Griffinflies occupied the skies for approximately 150 million years, exceeding the entire span during which non-avian dinosaurs dominated terrestrial ecosystems. Across changing continents, shifting climates, and evolving forests, they remained among the defining aerial hunters of their age. Generation followed, generation across, a duration almost beyond imagination. Measured against human history, their success appears almost permanent. Measured against geological time, permanence remained an illusion shared by every lineage that ever lived. When extinction finally reached its conclusion, almost nothing remained except physical traces preserved within stone. Fine networks of wing veins rested inside shale, deposited in places that are now France and the United States. Footprints crossed slabs of Carboniferous sandstone before hardening into trackways that outlasted the animals themselves. Fragments of exoskeleton became buried within sediments that later formed coal-bearing rocks. Each fossil captured a brief instant of existence, while the living creatures continued through countless unseen generations, all eventually ending without descendants to inherit their form. The world adjusted with remarkable completeness. Other predators filled the air. Other insects occupied familiar ecological roles. Forests transformed, climates shifted, and continents drifted onward. Nothing waited for the return of griffinflies, because evolution never retraces its path in perfect detail. The skies they once commanded became occupied by entirely different flyers, shaped through different histories and responding to different pressures. Today, their memory survives through fossils, scientific reconstruction, and the patterns written into Earth's history. Their kingdom endured across 150 million years before disappearing so thoroughly that many people pass through life without ever hearing their name. Stone alone preserves the outline of wings that once defined an age, offering a lasting reminder that even the longest dominion can dissolve until only its imprint remains. Across the long arc of this story, one idea rises above the details of wings, forests, predators, and fossils. It concerns the changing meaning of power itself. The giant insects did not disappear because large size suddenly became impossible. They vanished because the value of being large changed. A trait that had rewarded countless generations was transformed into a disadvantage when the surrounding world acquired a new kind of hunter. For approximately 150 million years, great size offered extraordinary advantages in the air. A broad wingspan allowed efficient travel, commanding presence, and the ability to overpower smaller prey. Few creatures possessed the speed or maneuverability to threaten such flyers. Success reinforced itself across generation after generation. Natural selection repeatedly favored bodies capable of growing larger because the skies contained little that could challenge them. Within that world, large size represented one of evolution's most reliable investments. Then the balance shifted with remarkable speed in geological terms. The emergence and diversification of birds altered the rules within only a few million years, an interval that scarcely registers against the immense scale of Earth's history. Once agile aerial predators became common, every increase in body size carried an added cost. Larger insects accelerated less efficiently, turned more gradually, and presented easier targets during pursuit. Selection began rewarding different qualities. Smaller bodies, sharper reflexes, and more responsive flight gradually replaced sheer scale as the path toward survival. Nothing about the giant insects suggests poor adaptation. They match their environment with extraordinary precision. Their anatomy reflected millions of years of refinement under conditions where atmospheric chemistry, abundant oxygen, and limited aerial competition favored immense dimensions. Their evolutionary history prepared them for the world they inhabited. It offered no blueprint for a sky increasingly filled with fast vertebrate hunters capable of matching and surpassing their aerial abilities. A comparable pattern appears much later during the disappearance of many large mammals near the close of the Pleistocene epoch. For immense spans of time, large body size protected numerous species from predators while allowing efficient movement across broad landscapes. The spread of human hunters altered those conditions. Although the comparison remains imperfect because the organisms and circumstances differed, the underlying logic follows a similar path. A characteristic that once promoted survival became increasingly costly after a new ecological force entered the system. The fossil record of insects contributes something unusually precise to this broader principle. Through the careful measurement of 10,500 fossil wings, Scientists can identify the interval during which the relationship between body size and survival changed direction. The transition is recorded across successive layers of geological time with unusual clarity. Instead of relying upon broad impressions, the evidence traces when the advantage reversed and how that reversal became permanent across later ecosystems. The deeper lesson, therefore, reaches beyond insects alone. No characteristic carries permanent value in evolution. Strength, speed, intelligence, camouflage, or immense size possess meaning only within the environmental and biological circumstances surrounding them. Atmospheric chemistry establishes possibilities. Predators redefine them, competitors reshape them, and changing ecosystems continually rewrite the balance. The giant insects flourished because their world rewarded greatness of scale. When that world transformed, power acquired a different form, and evolution followed the new conditions with unwavering patience across the ages. Raise your eyes toward the open air, and it becomes possible to see something far older than weather or clouds. The space above every forest, meadow, river, and shoreline carries the memory of countless struggles that unfolded long before humanity appeared. Flight did more than lift animals away from the ground. It opened a new realm of opportunity, one that every successful lineage would eventually attempt to claim. Across hundreds of millions of years, the sky became an ecological resource, shaped again and again by those capable of entering it. When the earliest winged insects first rose into the air during the Devonian and Carboniferous, they encountered a realm without aerial rivals. For tens of millions of years, no vertebrate pursued them through flight. The atmosphere offered freedom from many terrestrial dangers while presenting an immense landscape filled with untapped possibilities. Evolution explored that freedom with remarkable creativity. Diverse forms appeared, new hunting strategies emerged, and body size expanded into dimensions that later ages would scarcely believe possible. The griffinflies inherited this inheritance of opportunity. Their immense wings carried them across forests where few creatures could challenge them once they had taken flight. The absence of persistent aerial opposition allowed natural selection to reward increasing scale whenever atmospheric conditions supported it. Their extraordinary dimensions were not accidents of evolution. They reflected a sky that imposed relatively few penalties upon growing larger. Opportunity itself became a creative force, encouraging forms that later ecosystems could no longer sustain. Another chapter began during the Triassic when pterosaurs entered the air. Their arrival marked the first substantial challenge to insect dominance above the landscape. Flying reptiles introduced fresh competition into a realm that insects had occupied alone for immense spans of geological time. Even so, giant insects continued to survive because the contest remained incomplete. Multiple kinds of flyers now shared the atmosphere, each occupying different ecological roles without entirely excluding the others from their established ways of life. The balance shifted more profoundly after birds diversified. Feathered hunters combined speed, maneuverability, sharp vision, and active pursuit in ways that altered the economics of flight itself. Under these conditions, agility became increasingly valuable while immense size imposed mounting disadvantages. The atmosphere ceased, rewarding the traits that had once elevated the griffinflies. Every generation of surviving insects experienced selection within this transformed arena, gradually favoring smaller bodies capable of sharper turns and faster acceleration. One interval still remained beyond the reach of birds. Darkness offered flying insects a portion of the daily cycle where many feathered predators were less effective. That refuge narrowed when bats evolved, powered flight, and spread through nocturnal ecosystems. With skilled hunters now active after sunset as well as during daylight, the remaining sanctuary became another contested environment. The air no longer belonged exclusively to any single lineage at any hour. The sky visible today reflects the accumulated outcome of these successive arrivals. Every dragonfly crossing a pond, every moth circling a flower after dusk, every butterfly weaving across a meadow carries adaptations shaped by predators that transformed aerial life across 150 million years. The atmosphere overhead is therefore more than empty space, waiting to be crossed. It is an ecosystem continually rewritten by competition, where each successful newcomer changed the possibilities available to every creature that followed, leaving the modern world suspended within the outcome of that enduring contest. A dragonfly suspended above a pond appears almost unchanged from one season to the next. Its flight lasts only a short while, yet the lineage behind that fragile body stretches across nearly 300 million years. Long before dinosaurs crossed the land, dragonfly ancestors already hunted above wetlands. They endured the Permian extinction, the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, and more than 150 million years of relentless pressure from feathered predators. Their story is measured less by permanence than by persistence through continual change. The insects gliding through modern air are not the giant griffinflies themselves. Those magnificent hunters vanished completely, leaving no surviving descendants. Modern dragonflies belong to a separate lineage that shared many ecological traits with those earlier rulers of the sky while following a different evolutionary path. Across immense spans of time, they became smaller, lighter, and far more maneuverable. Their survival depended upon refinement rather than expansion. Every generation carried subtle improvements that accumulated until flight itself became an extraordinary display of precision. Much of that precision begins with vision. A dragonfly's compound eyes contain as many as 30,000 individual lenses, allowing an almost uninterrupted view of the surrounding world. They detect polarized light reflected from water, helping them locate breeding sites and suitable hunting grounds. Their nervous system performs another remarkable task. Within dense swarms of flying insects, a dragonfly can lock onto one chosen target while ignoring countless distractions around it. This form of selective attention, identified through modern scientific research, remains an active subject of investigation because its neurological mechanisms are still not fully understood. Exceptional perception would matter little without equally remarkable control in flight. Dragonflies can hover, accelerate, reverse direction, move sideways, and pivot through the air with astonishing precision. Their forewings operate with a degree of independence that gives them exceptional stability during pursuit. Studies consistently report hunting success approaching 95%, placing them among the most effective predators known. Such efficiency reflects the cumulative effect of natural selection. Individuals unable to capture sufficient prey or unable to escape the birds pursuing them contributed less often to future generations. Viewed through this longer history, the modern dragonfly represents neither decline nor an incomplete echo of larger ancestors. Its body preserves solutions shaped by repeated environmental change, shifting competitors, and persistent predation. Features that once favored immense size gradually yielded to characteristics that rewarded speed, awareness, and control. The outcome was an insect capable of thriving in a world transformed many times over, carrying forward a design continually revised by experience written across geological time. The larger lesson reaches beyond any single lineage. Evolution offers no lasting reward for being the biggest or the strongest. Every advantage exists only within the conditions that created it, and those conditions never remain fixed forever. Survival belongs to organisms able to meet the demands of each changing age, one generation after another, across intervals too long for any individual life to imagine. The giant aerial hunters could not continue along that path. The dragonfly did, and every one that hovers above still water carries that enduring history within the rhythm of its wings. The story gradually reaches the present, where another flyer has entered the history of the sky without wings of its own. Human beings did not become aerial hunters through biological evolution. Thought, cooperation, and technology carried them upward instead. Even so, our species has become another force capable of reshaping the lives of creatures that depend upon the air. The pattern is familiar in its consequences, though entirely different in the path that produced it. Evidence gathered across many regions suggests that insect populations have declined substantially during recent decades. Several large scientific reviews estimate that roughly 40% of insect species are experiencing declines in abundance or distribution, although the pace and severity differ among habitats and regions. Unlike the transformation brought about by birds and later by bats, this change does not arise from direct pursuit through flight. The pressures come from landscapes altered by agriculture, expanding cities, widespread pesticide use, artificial light that changes natural behavior, and a climate whose patterns are shifting more rapidly than many species have previously experienced. Each pressure alone presents a challenge. Together, they reshape ecosystems with remarkable speed. Wetlands disappear beneath development. Grasslands become fragmented into isolated patches. Seasonal rhythms that once guided breeding, migration, and flowering begin to drift apart. Night skies glow with artificial illumination, drawing insects away from natural behaviors that evolved over immense spans of time. These influences spread simultaneously across continents, reaching places separated by thousands of kilometers, which is about 621 miles, while affecting countless interconnected food webs. An unusual thread connects this modern chapter to the distant Carboniferous forests explored earlier. The coal that fueled industrial civilization formed from the compressed remains of swamp vegetation that flourished during the same geological period when giant insects dominated the air. Those forests enriched Earth's atmosphere with abundant oxygen before their remains settled into sediments that slowly became coal. Humanity later extracted those deposits and burned them for energy, releasing large quantities of carbon dioxide that now contribute to atmospheric change. The forests that once helped create conditions favorable for giant insects have, through an extraordinary chain of geological events, become part of another transformation affecting their distant relatives. The comparison with birds and bats reveals an important distinction. Feathered and furred flyers altered insect evolution through natural selection operating across millions of years. Generation followed generation, allowing prey and predator to adapt together within changing ecosystems. Human influence unfolds across decades. Entire landscapes can be transformed within a single lifetime, compressing ecological change into intervals almost immeasurably brief compared with the rhythms recorded in the fossil record. The giant aerial hunters of the distant past persisted for roughly 150 million years before conditions shifted beyond their ability to respond. Modern insects face a different collection of pressures, yet they encounter them at a pace unparalleled in their evolutionary history. Some species adapt, others expand into new habitats, and many continue to decline despite remarkable resilience. Stone preserves the final chapters of the griffinflies with unwavering clarity. Their fossils remind us that disappearance is not an abstract idea, but an observable outcome repeated throughout Earth's history. The dragonflies, still crossing today's ponds, testify that adaptation can carry a lineage across astonishing spans of time. Whether enough of today's insects can do the same remains one of ecology's most significant unanswered questions, unfolding within the living world around us. Some spans of time resist every ordinary measure. 150 million years is one of them. The number can be spoken in a single breath, written in a single line, or marked on a chart with little effort. Its true scale remains almost impossible to grasp because every instinct formed within a human lifetime reaches its limit long before such a duration begins to feel real. The reign of the giant griffinflies stretched across nearly that entire interval. Their lineage occupied the skies for almost as long as the age of the dinosaurs, whose history lasted about 165 million years. By comparison, the entire history of the genus Homo extends for roughly 3 million years. Anatomically modern humans have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. The creatures whose wings once cast shadows across Carboniferous wetlands remained part of Earth's living fabric for about 500 times longer than our own species has walked the planet. Such longevity might suggest permanence, yet deep time rarely grants permanent victories. The ending did not arrive in a single season or through one overwhelming disaster. Generation followed generation, while the pressures surrounding them accumulated with almost imperceptible persistence. Each slight advantage gained by feathered hunters altered survival by only a small margin. Those margins gathered across millions of years until the balance had shifted beyond recovery. Evolution often changes direction through countless tiny differences that become visible only after extraordinary stretches of time. Human experience rarely prepares the mind for this pace. We remember days, celebrate years, and record centuries. Geological history unfolds through intervals measured in millions of years, while the disappearance of entire evolutionary lineages may occupy tens of millions more. Within such scales, even dramatic biological transformations resemble gradual curves instead of abrupt cliffs. Cause and consequence separate so widely that they appear almost motionless when viewed from the perspective of a single lifetime. This is why the collection of more than 10,500 fossil wings carries such remarkable importance. Each fossil represents one point within a sequence, extending across immense spans of history. Alone, a single wing reveals the proportions of one insect. Together, those specimens become something much greater. They trace a continuous pattern through time, allowing researchers to follow changes in maximum body size across successive geological periods with unusual precision. For much of that record, the line remains remarkably consistent. Large aerial predators continued to flourish despite fluctuations in climate and atmospheric chemistry. Then the pattern begins to bend. The change is measurable rather than imagined. That bend aligns with the spread of birds through ancient ecosystems, marking the point where biological pressure overtook environmental opportunity as the dominant influence on maximum insect size. From that moment onward, the trajectory never returned to its earlier course. Every dragonfly crossing a modern pond belongs to the world that followed this turning point. Every bee, butterfly, beetle, and flying ant carries an inheritance shaped after that gradual reversal had already taken hold. The curve preserved within those fossil wings is more than a scientific graph. It is a record of a world changing direction with extraordinary patience, leaving every living flying insect to inhabit the long aftermath of a transformation that began 150 million years ago. One thought lingers after the fossils have been measured, the graphs completed, and the timelines assembled. What does it truly mean for a lineage to dominate Earth's skies for 150 million years, only to disappear so completely that no living descendant remains? The question resists any simple conclusion because it challenges the way success is usually imagined, both in nature and in human history. Modern perspectives often measure evolutionary achievement by survival into the present. A lineage that still exists appears victorious, while one that vanished seems to have failed. The griffinflies complicate that picture. They remained among the most formidable aerial predators Earth has ever produced, flourishing across immense spans of geological time. Their bodies, diversity, and ecological influence testify to extraordinary evolutionary success. Their disappearance does not erase those accomplishments, nor does it diminish the countless generations that thrived before the final chapter closed. Measured by duration alone, their record is astonishing. They endured longer than the non-avian dinosaurs. They exceeded the reign of the great marine reptiles that once crossed prehistoric seas. They outlasted the giant mammals that later wandered the plains of the Cenozoic era. Very few animal groups can claim such continuity across changing continents, shifting climates, and repeated environmental upheavals. Their history occupies an immense portion of the story of life, even though almost none of it survives in public memory. Human culture remembers different creatures. Museums display towering skeletons of tyrannosaurs. Films celebrate colossal reptiles with familiar names. Children learn about dinosaurs long before they encounter the word griffinfly. The imbalance is striking because the skies belong to these enormous insects for nearly the same span of time. Their legacy rests mostly within specialized scientific literature, preserved among rock layers and museum collections rather than within shared imagination. Part of that absence may come from their unfamiliar form. A giant insect stretches the imagination differently than a giant reptile. Wings built from delicate membranes seem less monumental than massive bones, even when the ecological achievement behind them was equally profound. Another reason lies within the fossil record itself. Complete insect fossils are comparatively uncommon, their slender bodies preserved only under exceptional conditions. Every discovery offers valuable evidence, yet the picture remains assembled from scattered fragments instead of towering skeletons that dominate exhibition halls. This absence from memory creates an unusual echo of extinction. The biological lineage ended millions of years ago, while recognition faded along a separate path. One loss occurred within ecosystems, the other unfolded within human awareness. Stone preserved their outlines with remarkable fidelity, yet their story rarely entered the wider narrative people tell about Earth's distant past. Their legacy, therefore, rests less in fame than in understanding. The fossil wings, trackways, and fragments of exoskeleton reveal that evolutionary success cannot be measured only by reaching the present day. Fortune, changing environments, new competitors, and unpredictable turning points all shape which lineages continue and which become chapters sealed within rock. The griffinflies remind us that even one of the longest and most accomplished aerial dynasties in Earth's history could end completely, leaving behind little more than impressions in stone, careful scientific records, and the enduring invitation to reconsider what survival has truly meant across the immense passage of deep time. The Carboniferous sky no longer exists. The atmosphere that once carried giant wings has changed. The forests that sustained that world have long since vanished beneath layers of stone. The towering insects that ruled those air currents disappeared millions of years ago. Their kingdom did not survive into the present, and the conditions that allowed it to flourish belong to a chapter of Earth that can never return in its original form. What remains is shaped as much by absence as by survival. Every stretch of open air is occupied by descendants of lineages that endured the long contest for flight. The skies now belong to creatures built for rapid turns, precise pursuit, and constant vigilance. Their bodies reflect countless generations of adjustment to competitors, predators, and changing environments. Flight itself continues, though the rules governing it have been rewritten many times since the last griffinfly crossed an ancient horizon. Every bird heard at dawn carries an inheritance, extending far beyond its own species. Feathered wings represent more than an elegant solution to flight. They also preserve the legacy of one of Earth's longest evolutionary rivalries. Across 150 million years, birds refined speed, maneuverability, perception, and aerial control. Those qualities transform the skies into a place where immense size no longer guaranteed success. The world overhead became an arena where precision steadily outweighed sheer scale. Dragonflies remain part of that same story. They no longer possess the enormous proportions of their distant relatives, yet they retain extraordinary mastery of the air. Their movements seem effortless, although every rapid turn and every accurate interception reflects selection operating across immense spans of geological time. The creature hovering above a pond today is not a diminished echo of the past. It is the surviving expression of a lineage that continued changing while many others disappeared, carrying within its body the accumulated solutions to challenges repeated across millions upon millions of years. Far below the surface, another connection endures. Coal seams preserve the compressed remains of forests that once filled the Carboniferous landscape. Those forests enriched the atmosphere that supported giant insects, then settled into sediment and slowly transformed beneath pressure over extraordinary intervals. Humanity has extracted that ancient carbon and returned much of it to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide through the burning of coal. The air surrounding modern insects is therefore influenced, in part, by the remains of the same forests that once sustained their distant ancestors, completing a chain of cause and consequence stretching across hundreds of millions of years. 150 million years is longer than the reign of most groups that have ever inhabited Earth. That remarkable chapter reached its conclusion without a single overwhelming catastrophe directed specifically at the giants. No solitary impact marked their ending. No sudden volcanic winter erased them in an instant. Their decline unfolded through the steady arrival of feathered hunters whose remarkable agility altered the balance of survival. Those predators pursued food, reproduced, and adapted without intention, yet those ordinary acts reshaped the future of flight. The sky above the present world bears the imprint of that transformation. Every bird crossing the horizon and every dragonfly tracing circles above still water belongs to the long aftermath of those ancient changes. The giants have vanished completely, yet the living air remains filled with descendants, survivors, and enduring consequences, each carrying forward the story of the sky they left behind.